This month's lecture to the British Archaeological Association for May 2020 is given by Penny Coombe. Penny's currently completing her DPhil in Classical Archaeology at Wolfson College, Oxford, with a dissertation on figure sculpture in Roman Britain and its relationships to Continental sculpture. This work's been supported by several bodies, including the British Academy, the Roman Society, the Universität zu Köln and the BAA. Penny won an Ox Scholarship last year. As an undergraduate student, Penny read Ancient and Modern History at Oxford between 2002 and 2005, and she then went on to do an MA in Ancient History at University College London. She worked at the Museum of London while assisting with the preparation of the London and South East England fascicle of the Corpus Signorum Imperii Romani. The British Academy published this volume, which Penny joint-authored with Martin Hennig in 2018. As well as doing that, she's found time to publish a number of papers in peer-reviewed journals and essay collections. And there's a lot one could say about Penny's enterprise and all the work she's done. She teaches at Royal Holloway in Oxford currently, and some of us will know her from her Cycling Archaeologist Twitter feed, from which we learned that Penny's an enthusiastic cyclist whose journeys to sites of historic interest show, as well as anything really, that one can combine two enthusiasms and stay fit while doing scholarship. So an example to all of us. The title of Penny's lecture today is Sculpture in Roman Britain and its Continental Context.
Hi everyone, I hope you're keeping well at the moment. I'm sure this is not the preferred situation for many of us, but I'm delighted and grateful for the chance still to present my paper and to you all for tuning in to listen. Thanks especially to Meg Bernstein, John McNeill and Lloyd de Beer of the BAA for making it all happen. I really hope we can meet in future in more auspicious times. I'm going to talk to you today about the sculpture from the northwest region of the Roman Empire in the 1st to 4th centuries, and particularly the connections between the artistic output of Britain and that seen on the continent, especially in Germany. The main idea or question that I'd like us all to think about is what more can we learn about Roman provincial sculpture when we move beyond the notion of province and consider other geographies of art in the northwest region of the Roman Empire. So a small explanation of what I mean by that. The province is typically the unit of currency for much discussion of the Roman world. Government under the empire was arranged by these territories, and our modern catalogues are often divided up into finds from or consideration of these geographic areas. Of course, this generalises somewhat, but I hope you can sign up to this as the premise. Here we have a map of the Roman Empire at its largest extent, with all of the provinces delineated, a relatively common sight in books about the Roman world. As Appian wrote in his preface to his Roman history, intending to write the history of the Romans, I have deemed it best to begin with the boundaries of the nations under their sway. Provincial is of course a political and geographic term, and is applied to the regions away from Italy and the Mediterranean shores. But it has also been used to describe certain characteristics, a style, and especially a quality. In some ways, this goes back to the Romans themselves. Pliny here describes southern France as Italia varius quam provincia, not so much a province as part of Italy, according to its culture. Too often, however, provincial has become shorthand for bad or imperfect sculptural representations that somehow fail to match the proper classicism of the Mediterranean pieces. Now outdated, models such as Romanization or centre periphery theory have been used in the past to explain the differences seen in provincial art by suggesting that Roman culture somehow ripples out to the far-flung reaches of the empire, becoming ever weaker as it does so. More recently, globalization theory has been anachronistically co-opted from modern economics to the ancient world to offer an explanation for the spread of culture. An even more horrendous term, glocalization, is used to describe local adaptation against a homogeneous background. I think it's interesting and useful to take this further, setting aside the theory for now, to consider different geographies of art of the provinces in two ways. First, to explore how the political boundaries mapped onto geographical or cultural divisions and barriers during the Roman period. We can consider how interaction of communities, craftsmen, consumers, and other factors affect the sculptural output of the region, and how identities such as soldier, civilian, urban and rural, rich and poor, and the different ways of exhibiting identity within these groups affect the use and forms of art rather than a self-conscious notion of province. Additionally, we can start to think across the boundaries that can become rather ossified in the modern scholarship for a variety of reasons, such as difference in different languages, scholarly traditions, or even simply the practical organisation of catalogues into different areas. By reconsidering existing divisions and reconstructing the geography of the art of the Northwest along different lines, I think we can create a more nuanced imagining of the provincial within the monolith of Roman art. I'm aiming to do that by systematically comparing the material from the provinces of Britain and those near neighbours on the continent. This is the topic of my current DPhil research, the final chapters of which are being written with the generous support of a BAA Ox Scholarship, for which I'm very grateful. I would also like to here record my thanks to Peter Stewart, who is my DPhil supervisor at Oxford, and to Martin Hennig for their advice and support over recent years. The area of the Northwest was chosen since the provinces of Britannia, Germania Inferior, and Germania Superior within it are similar enough that they bear comparison. They were heavily militarised in the Roman period, and we know that there was regular interaction and connectivity through networks of people and goods. To make the project manageable, 3 case study types are examined in order to draw out practical examples. These are rider reliefs, typically set up to commemorate auxiliary cavalrymen in the 1st and 2nd centuries, so-called mother goddess dedications, typically of the 2nd and 3rd centuries, and imperial portraits from the whole Roman period. This selection covers a cross-section of the kinds of groups and communities and the contexts involved in setting up sculpture, the religious, military, and political or administrative. They also include a mixture of forms that are popular locally and those that we might expect to see across the Roman world. Thus, we can hope to access difference and similarities and explore these further. So today, I'd like to present these case studies to elaborate upon some specific cases of interaction that I think bear exploring at a more granular level, and to set out for you my main observations on routes of connectivity so far. 4 routes are particularly considered: the culture transferring role of the army, trade routes both as openings of connections between areas in general, but also routes of supply of raw materials or craft skills, political or state interactions, and the impact of networks of religious groups. Each study will speak to one or more of these routes. Finally, I will offer some early conclusions on a better way of constructing the connections and distinctions between sculpture in Roman Britain and that on the continent, rather than the focus on provincial. First, I'd like to set the scene of the provincial in the Northwest. How does the sculpture of this area seem to interact with provincial boundaries, and where can we go further? In many ways, the art, and especially the stone carving of the Roman Empire, is remarkably similar across large areas and amongst a range of people. Zooming out from the Northwest for a moment, we see that altars are dedicated to gods, stones mark graves and record the names of the deceased, and monuments and statues are put up for locally famous people from Britain to the deserts of Arabia and Africa. Motifs and forms of ancient art were transmitted across time and space and became popular with a range of audiences. Beneath this remarkable homogeneity, however, lies considerable regional variation and local adaptation. I think one of the most potent descriptions of the phenomenon, the line between universality of Roman artistic forms, or a kind of language, and local representation, is offered by Lucian in his description of the worship of Hercules in Gaul. So as he says, our Heracles is known among the Gauls under the local name of Ogmius, and the appearance he presents in their pictures is truly grotesque. They make him out as old can be. The few hairs he has left, he is quite bald on the front, are dead white, and his skin is wrinkled and tanned as black as any old salt's. You would take him for some infernal deity, for Charon or Iapetus, anyone rather than Heracles. Such as he is, however, and I think this is the key point, he has all the proper attributes of that god. The lion's skin hangs over his shoulders, his right hand grasps the club, his left the strung bow, and a quiver is slung at his side. Nothing is wanting to the Heraclean equipment. I think we can see this borne out in a practical example from eastern France. Here we have all of the elements of Hercules. The lion skin, club, the beefy guy. It employs, as Lucian would say, all the right features. But the result is not the naturalism of a classical marble. It is not the powerful hero that we usually see. The lions are a bit small and weedy. Hercules doesn't actually grasp the club, but seems to rest his hand on it. The bodies are not naturalistically proportioned, and the facial hair seems to have more in common with earlier Germanic figures than contemporary Roman ones. The sculpture in the Rhineland area of Germany and that in Britain seems to have much in common. There are certain types of monument and forms or motifs that are only seen in these locations, and sometimes only for a short amount of time, as if comprising a particular fashion. For instance, so-called Jupiter columns are found primarily in France and Germany. These slightly mysterious monuments generally have a 4- or 6-sided base carved with relief images of gods, an imbricated column shaft, a Corinthian capital, and then a figure either of Jupiter enthroned or a horseman riding down a giant on the top. A few examples have been identified in Britain, though none survive as complete. Here is an example of just the capital from Cirencester. There's another piece of decorated column shaft from London, and recent excavations at Maryport on the Cumbrian coast suggest there may have been one there, amongst others. Funerary banquet or totem scenes are a common design on tombstones. The motifs seen in the east of the empire also seems to have travelled further west, perhaps along the Danube and into Germany and Britain. This form is a good example of the popularity of a motif in a range of areas, with chronological development of the form suggesting transmission between different places, but also adaptation in different areas. Peter Stewart has revised and contracted the time frame for the movement of the Totenmal tombstone in the northwest, from Germany into Britain, in the 1st and 2nd centuries. The two examples on this slide seem particularly comparable, with similar arrangement of the motif, similar forms, similar styles, though from different places and set up at different times. There are also some key differences in use of the motif, however, not least the fact that it is employed by different groups of people. In Germany, these are typically reserved for soldiers' grave markers, while in Britain they are also used to commemorate women and civilians. Not only the forms, but also the stones themselves are shared between the provinces. The northwest region is typically considered beyond the trade in Mediterranean white marbles, with local sandstones and limestones offering the raw materials. Kevin Hayward's petrological analyses have shown that one of the earliest dated carved tombstones in Roman Britain, that of the centurion Marcus Favonius Faculus, dating from the mid-1st century and from Colchester, was carved in Lothringer limestone that is quarried on the banks of the river Moselle in eastern France, while his work on other stones of southern Britain explain the interactions of demand and supply, particularly in the 1st and 2nd centuries. So in summary so far, we should not be surprised that there are similarities across the northwest, especially since the division between regions is partly notional. At the same time, the differences that we do see within this area become interesting and significant if we consider that they're not inevitable or natural. So it begs the question, why is sculpture in Britain often so different, given the proximities to Gallia Belgica and the German provinces, both physically and in terms of the kinds of communities present? To consider this further, I would now like to examine the key points of my 3 case studies in turn. drawing out from them the points of interaction between Britain and the northwest continent. I should first mention the nature of the evidence, since this has a significant impact on the observations that can be made and the conclusions that can be drawn. We rarely see in the archaeological record an object as it was when in use, and so there is a certain amount of original context that is usually lost, particularly when fashions of collecting over several hundred years are involved. Secondary use, damage, and destruction limits what can be noted of the iconography and forms of some monuments, and some information, such as the chronology or the identity of the maker, can only be surmised from the appearance of the remains. Here we have one example, a secondary use in antiquity of this rider stela from Mainz, which was cut into to accept a new burial as a sarcophagus. So, to turn to my first case study, rider reliefs. These reliefs, showing a victorious horseman, can be found in several areas at the edge of the Roman Empire, from northern Africa to the Black Sea, and along the Danubian provinces. They are, however, most common in the Rhineland, where there are around 50 examples, and in the military areas of Britain, with around 25. The grave stelae were set up to commemorate cavalrymen, generally auxiliaries, and appeared during the 1st and perhaps into the early 2nd centuries AD. Scholarship to date has tended to focus on two aspects. First, researchers have sought to discover the origins of this type, some tracing the motif of a heroic horseman as far back as the period of the tombstone of Dexilaus in the Kerameikos Cemetery in Athens, through Hellenistic battle scenes like that in the Alexander mosaic of around 100 BC, and to later victorious battle scenes like this one from the Great Trajanic Frieze, now part of the Arch of Constantine. Transmission via the Danubian provinces has also been suggested, since there is widespread use of the horseman motif for dedications to the Thracian or Danubian rider gods in that region. But this seems less likely to account for the appearance of the German and British stelae. Certainly, Thracian horsemen are commemorated, but not exclusively, and these tombstones are also set up for soldiers from Gaul, Rhaetia, Hispania, Belgica, Parthia, and Germania, and the rider gods are never shown defeating a foe or in quite this arrangement. Secondly, these reliefs are considered as examples of binding the community of Roman auxiliaries. As non-citizens, until they had completed 25 years' service, though an honoured and well-paid sector of the army, auxiliaries may have sought a common status after death, particularly since they were often immigrants to the areas in which they served and died. Here, the conquering horseman makes an impressive statement, showing the deceased rider as a hero, as well as offering unity with other auxiliary cavalrymen. So to turn now to the forms of the German and British tombstones. The key difference between the German and British iconography is the inclusion or not of a servant or Carlo groom figure. In Germany, the carving shows more placid scenes, the heroic horseman accompanied by this groom, and sometimes without a fallen enemy. By contrast, in Britain, the enemy is almost always shown, and the servant very rarely. Does this reflect reality? That more cavalrymen in Germany had servants, or wanted to flaunt the fact that their pay allowed them to hire a groom, than in Britain? Was a posting to Britain seen as more dangerous, and so the manner of the heroism shown on a funerary monument heightened? Within the broad type, considerable individuality was possible. Attributes associated with a soldier's particular role were included in the carvings. On the left, we see Andes at Mainz, who may have been a tubican since he is shown here with a trumpet. Flavinus from Corbridge is a signifer and carries his standard in the centre. Maris is shown on his monument at Mainz with bow and arrow, likely his preferred weapon. Without archaeological contexts, and relying primarily on style, these are rather hard to date accurately, but I think it's important to do so to understand how the form progressed and was circulated. The earliest known in Germany date probably from the reign of Tiberius, around the 30s AD, and come from Worms and Mainz. These very first stelae feature most often just a man on a horse, usually without a fallen enemy or a servant figure. At Bonn, all of the rider reliefs have been dated to the Claudian period, none of them featuring a fallen enemy. However, the fallen foe swiftly becomes part of the canon at Mainz, Worms, and Wiesbaden from the Claudian and into the Neronian periods, around the 40s to 60s AD. Finally, at Mainz and Cologne, the later examples most likely date from the Flavian period, probably the 70s AD. This concentration of the monuments within the 1st century reflects wider trends in funerary monuments, for instance at Mainz, where around 85% of all figural funerary monuments so far catalogued date to that period. In Britain, the progression of the type seems to parallel closely the movement of troops as they gradually pushed further into the island and invaded more of the province during the 1st century. The first example at Colchester dates to the late 40s AD. Then we have others further west at Bath, Gloucester and Cirencester, before the field of military activity moved north to Wroxeter, Lancaster, Ribchester and Corbridge in the Flavian period. The appearance of rider relief seems to follow relatively soon after the establishment of a fort, or at least within the next couple of decades, but did not linger as a fashion. A second flourishing of the motif may have occurred in Britain in the late 2nd or early 3rd century, though again the dating is not confirmed. This group is concentrated at Chester, where several reliefs were used to build the north wall of the 3rd century fort, as well as on Hadrian's Wall, and are dedicated to legionaries as well as auxiliaries. 2 stelae at Worms have been dated to the 3rd or 4th century, largely on the basis of epigraphic formulations, but again no longer feature an enemy or servant. Between these 2 periods, auxiliary cavalrymen in Britain and Germany appeared to prefer the Totenmahl or funerary banquet scene for figural tombstones. So how did the fashion develop and move around? We might assume that this form was the preserve of 1 or 2 particular army units, and the geographical distribution reflects their deployment. But this is shown not to be the case. A few examples are indeed set up to men from the Ala Noriccorum, and seem to form a group that uses the motif in similar ways. The monument of Gaius Romanius Capito from Mainz, on the left here, exhibits the harness and trappings, taut neck and dynamic pose seen on other stelae of the Neronian period onwards at Mainz, Worms and Cologne. Romanius is from the Ala Noriccorum, as is Titus Flavius Bassus, who is shown in this way at Cologne. However, men from the second Ala Flavia Gemina and the Ala Frontoniana are also commemorated, and there are stelae from Worms on which the inscriptions have broken off. If the iconography was indeed intended to create some common identity between auxiliaries, it would appear to be a more general approach, and this community spirit does not seem to align with certain units. We can also see that the form is probably not the preserve of a particular craftsman or group. Partly the duration of the fashion rules this out, but we can also identify considerable variation in quality and skill, even within a small geographic area. At Cirencester, the monuments of Sextus Valerius Genialis and Danicus are roughly contemporary, give or take a decade or so, and possess common iconographic features, but as you can see, there are clear differences in the quality of the execution. This raises questions of who is making these and how are they related to the soldiers employing the motif. Finally, here is a third comparative example, where analysis of the raw material can shed more light on how the form is shared and moved. The monuments of Longinus in Colchester and Rufus Seta at Gloucester both use similar forms and motifs. The rider, as we've seen before, defeats a foe within a niche that is topped by two lions and a sphinx. Interestingly, these are made of the same stone, Painswick stone quarried at Gloucester, but they are completed in different styles, clearly not work of the same hand. There is an association between the two locations. The 20th Legion, Valeria Victrix, was stationed at Colchester until AD 50, when that town became a veteran colony and provincial capital, and the Legion moved to Kingsholm, near Gloucester. Painswick stone is a fine-grained white limestone found not 10 kilometres from Kingsholm, and carves beautifully, taking a polish like white marble. It seems likely that the important town in the east could draw the best material and resources from across the country, and even influence later craftsmen's choice and arrangement of motifs. This all speaks to the wider questions of the interaction between sculptor and consumer. Was it the craftsman or the patron who decided what the finished product looked like, and what affected that choice? This is in part complicated by the fact we don't know who the sculptors are. There is a debate over the extent to which the soldiers themselves also worked as sculptors, or perhaps did civilian producers work to fulfill demand from the army. Some motifs do seem to move between provinces and areas as troops move from Germany and around Britain, suggesting to me that sculptors probably moved too. You can see on this selection of stelae that later ones seem to combine elements of motifs seen earlier. For instance, tombstones at Wroxeter combine the Sphinx and lion pediment decoration of rider reliefs at Colchester and Gloucester with the rosette of legionary stones from Mainz. Legions that operated in Britain were stationed at Mainz immediately before coming here, and perhaps craftsmen witnessed stones already set up or produced there. This slide I think is a bit complex, so I'll explain it in slightly more detail. So on the right-hand side, we can see the motifs on tombstones set up at Wroxeter in the AD 50s and 60s, seeming to borrow elements from those of legions stationed at Mainz, such as the 14th Gemina and the 4th Legion. In an apparently separate strand of influence shown on the left, the pediment decoration of lions and sphinx, which is seen on auxiliary cavalry tombstones in Colchester and Gloucester dating to the 40s and 50s, also appeared on the tombstone of the legionary Gaius Manius of the 20th Legion at Wroxeter, shown in the centre. I've added in the tombstone of Titus Claudius Terentius as a possible missing link, even though the top of that stone is missing. The 20th Legion is present at Colchester in the AD 40s, moving to Gloucester in around AD 50 and to Wroxeter by AD 66. The Legion stationed at Wroxeter from AD 58 to the mid-60s prior to the 20th Legion was the 14th Gemina, which, as we've seen, was at Mainz before that. The pediment floral decoration seems to combine with the lions and sphinx as the legions move from the Rhineland and the eastern part of Britain to the west, the army acting apparently as agent of transmission of these motifs. So, the case study of the rider reliefs, and set in the wider context of military tombstones and troop movements, appears to show that sculptural forms can be transmitted between specific groups in very specific and short-lived trends, and that the supply of raw materials and craft skills can play a role as much as the demand of the consumer in how reliefs looked. So, now to move on, my second case study is that of the matres and matronae figures in Britain and Germany, commonly translated using the blanket term mother goddesses. This example, I think, provides insight into religious communities and trade links, as well as the role of the army in circulating ideas. Around 350 carvings showing seated female goddesses have been found in this region, dating to the very end of the 1st century to around the mid-3rd century. In Britain, the women are more often referred to as matres, which does mean mother. Roughly contemporary with those from the Rhineland, the names also include epithets, but these in Britain mostly derive from Latin and emphasise the foreign aspect. Inscriptions refer to the matres transmarinae, or more specifically to the Gallic, African or Italian mothers. Figures are also known from Britain, but unlike the Rhineland, the images are carved on reliefs, or almost in the round, rather than on votive altars, and only one or two have an inscription that allows us to identify the women. This poses quite a problem for us defining which are mother goddesses and working out who we think worshippers thought they were approaching. Here is an example of one of the few dedications from Britain which has both image and inscription. It's probably from the eastern end of Hadrian's Wall, though the exact provenance is unknown. Of course, these figures and dedications have been studied at some length in the past, and work to date can be grouped broadly into a few themes. First, the study of the cult and what the images and dedications can tell us about location of temple sites and cult practice. Second, study of the inscriptions, particularly from the perspective of Celtic or Germanic names and language. And finally, and perhaps most extensively, as markers of ethnic identity. The Germanic or Celtic origins of the cult have been considered, and there is keen debate whether they offer an example of interpretatio Romana, or conversely, whether they show native resistance to an invading Roman culture. There has been in-depth analysis of the iconography of those on the continent by Gerhard Bauchans and others, but I think less work to examine the iconography of the British examples in the context of those continental ones. But this would appear to be a fruitful line of inquiry. So, setting out the common and key elements of the iconography, the classic form of the Matrona image in the Rhineland is well known. Here we have three women seated on a bench, two of whom appear to be older and have their hair pinned into the local headdress of the Ubian tribe, while the third sits between them with flowing locks. They all wear long draped clothing, gathered below the breast at the front and reaching to their ankles. They hold baskets of round objects, usually identified as loaves of bread or fruit such as apples. The altars from Cologne and Bonn in particular show the women seated within a shell canopy or pedimented niche, with Corinthian pilasters on either side. The sides of the altars are sometimes ornamented too. Figural scenes include images of people carrying jugs or other objects associated with religious practice, or otherwise tree branches or imbricated leaf decorations are shown. Variations include women accompanied by a dog, or very rarely by children, or sometimes the woman is shown alone. Sometimes they sit beneath a shell canopy, or the scene may be accompanied by one of sacrifice or dedication in a different panel. The forms in Britain appear to be more variable, but as noted, are seen less often on altars, along with an inscription. In Britain, the seated deities are seen as often alone as in groups of three, and in one case from London as a group of four. The figures are generally rendered similarly to one another. There is not the same age distinction or change in dress between the figures as seen on the Rhineland. Indeed, the large rounded headdress is never shown. Niches are used, and sometimes the women are sat each within her own recess. Attributes in Britain are generally confined to baskets of bread or fruit. Dogs are generally not shown, but there are a couple of examples with children. These figures seem to have much in common with reliefs from the Burgundy region of modern France, and here we see on the slide an example from Cirencester that appears to owe a lot to two other examples from Dijon and Vertot. Now turning to the locations of these dedications. In Germany, most of the altars are associated either with known temple sites or with secondary use locations in which the stone was reused to construct early Christian churches. Many of these religious sites are set within the countryside, but the new churches are often at the edge of an urban area. In Britain, while dedications and altars without figures are found largely at military sites, you can see on the left the map with the line at Hadrian's Wall and the identifiable fort areas of Chester, London, Dover and York. But more examples that do have figures are seen in civilian parts of the Cotswolds as well. There is, for instance, this cluster around Cirencester indicated on the map on the right, where a group of sculptures includes an altar dedicated to the Sylavii. The Sylavii are considered to be a version or group of these mother goddesses based on their association with an epithet. So this would set this group in the context of other examples of Sylavii dedications, such as this altar from Boulogne shown on the right. As I noted briefly earlier, the Matres and Matronite altars have in the past been recruited by scholars as evidence either of Romanisation or of resistance. There is a continuing discussion of these altars as evidence of, or as shorthand for, ethnic identity of the dedicators or of religious groups. The names, both of dedicators and the epithets of the deities themselves, the clothing, the patterning on the altars, and technical competence of the stone carving are all held up as markers of Celtic or Germanic ancestry, or sometimes just more generally as native as opposed to Roman. This bronze figurine from Henley Wood in Gloucestershire has been held up as some kind of pre-Roman ancestor for the Matres cult in Britain. This is curious, since the epigraphic record in Britain shows that dedicators to the Matres are overwhelmingly male, have Latin names, and belong to official or military groups. In Bonn, altars were dedicated by important men, soldiers, officials, senators, and priests. This is not the population of devotees one would expect for a religion of local resistance. Even in Cisalpine and Narbonensian Gaul and in Castile, where the dedicators tend to be slaves, freedmen, peregrini, and lower classes of civil servant, we don't see use of these images as an obvious show of resistance to Roman culture. There is clearly scope for a cult to resonate with different groups in different ways, but in general the society within which we ought to set these is the so-called long 2nd century, from the Flavian to Severan dynasties, a period of change and mobility of people, but not one of Celtic renaissance or resistance. Actually, I'll pause on that chronology for a second. The particular flourishing within the 2nd and into the 3rd centuries I think requires some explanation, and I'd like to mention it briefly here. I wonder if an important trigger may have been the use of the term Mother of the Camp for the empresses Faustina and Julia Domna from the mid to late 2nd century onwards. Even before this time, Hadrian proposed deification of Trajan's wife Plotina as Diva Mater, the Divine Mother. This red sandstone plaque from Carlisle records a dedication to the mother goddesses in conjunction with Julia Mamaea, the niece of Septimius Severus and mother of Severus Alexander, as Mother of our Lord and of the army. So far, we have seen that the army plays some role in transmission of this deity, but are there any other explanations? Perhaps networks of the religious communities themselves might play a role in transmitting ideas between provinces. The organisation of the cult is not well understood, though it has been supposed that groups of worshippers belonged to curiae or were associated with tribal groupings. An inscription at Chichester refers to a treasurer, perhaps someone who had arranged for this dedication. It is a fine piece of Purbeck marble, possibly set up by a group of worshippers to the Matres Domesticae. The restoration of a cult site in London by members of a district is commemorated on a piece of white marble. The dedications to the Sylavii at Cirencester have also been suggested as a cult centre, and we have already seen an example of an altar to the Sylavii at Boulogne. There are another 30 or 40 dedications to this version of the goddesses from across the northwest, and all of these examples suggest there is some kind of organisation. There are also available routes for spread of the cult, or at least the forms of the sculptures offered by the direct trade connections, not only through religious communities, and perhaps we should now consider the mercantile links between Britain and the continent as agents of transmission. Some patterns of movements of goods follow similar routes, as the appearance of Mother Goddess figures, using the Rhine route from central and southern France through Germany to Britain. There are clearly variable routes of supply more generally, with some goods leapfrogging closer markets to reach those further afield, as highlighted recently by Mike Fulford in his analysis of provision of terra sigillata in Britain. So I'd say it's not inconceivable that the Mother Goddess images used in Britain were inspired by those from southern Gaul, especially the Burgundian region that we have already seen, and perhaps northern Spain. These are certainly the areas in which references to martres are found, like in Britain, rather than the North Italian and Germanic matronae, which could have arrived with soldiers. Contacts also worked in two directions, and we should note an altar dedicated at Xanten by Lucius Valerius Simplex to the martres Brittii, the British mothers. Into this argument, we should introduce the evidence of the Nehelenia altars, over 190 of which have been found off the Dutch coast, presumably from a concentrated religious site centred on Koningsplat and Domburg. The iconography of the deity, as you can see, is remarkably similar to that of the mother goddesses. Dedications were made here by merchants plying routes between the Rhineland and Britain, and were perhaps encouraged by the presence of the deity on the shores of the Netherlands, a place where their fears for the journey could be best voiced before embarking upon the Channel crossing. The connection is not to be made just at the coast, however, since the Nehelenia altars are often carved from the fine Lothringer limestone from the Moselle banks that I mentioned earlier. The stone was initially exploited by military detachments, but by the 2nd and 3rd centuries seems to have been readily transported up the Rhine for use by civilians for these altars on the shores of the Channel. So, in summary from our Mother Goddess case study, the broad consensus in much British scholarship has been that the Mother Goddess cult arrived from Germania Inferior with the army, and to some extent we have seen this borne out in the distribution of dedications at military sites. This is a cult with strong geographic context when in Germania Inferior, but a goddess whose power is not diminished when called upon by those abroad. Indeed, the goddesses are sought out by people who move between locations, and the reliefs offer a fine example of iconographic and epigraphic transmission between provinces. I think we can see some emerging associations between the figures in more civilian areas of Gaul, and possible religious groups operating either side of the Channel, not only the military. Connections of cult and through other routes like trade, therefore, seem equally, if not more, possible. So finally, I turn to the third case study, imperial portraits. We have so far seen that there are nuanced similarities and differences between the appearance of some tombstones and some religious dedications in Britain and Germany, and that there are potential reasons for this that relate to raw materials, role of the craftsmen and their skills, and transmission by people moving around the northwest region through localized networks of religion, trade, and the army. We would perhaps expect this final case study to be aligned more closely with the centre of Roman imperial power, at least ideologically, and perhaps for connections to be found across a larger area in a state-controlled or political mechanism. Examination is somewhat hampered by the nature of the evidence. Basically, there really aren't very many portrait sculptures from the northwest in general, and those we do have can only very rarely be safely identified as the emperor. One head from Cologne was stored in this box shown on the left, with the latest interpretation added in light of new research over the years and the previous one crossed out. Only one example of an imperial portrait head has been consistently identified as such in the whole northwestern region. This bronze head of Hadrian, found in the Thames and now on display at the British Museum. This lack of statuary is an interesting avenue of inquiry in itself, suggesting that the currency of public honorific portraiture, more common in the eastern parts of the empire, did not hold such value and importance in the west. But sadly, I don't have time today to develop that point more fully. Scholarship on imperial portraits has traditionally involved setting the heads into a type series, explaining the uncanny similarities through setting out a process for creating and circulating agreed prototypes of the emperor's image. None of the Romano-British or Romano-Germanic heads can be fit comfortably into one of these type series, emphasising that there is more diversity than the positivism of typological studies favours. A now dominant alternative trend in research examines the imperial image as the product of local choices that resonated with viewers in different places. Even from the small sample that we have, we can observe some key points of similarity and difference between imperial portraits in Britain and those on the continent. First, in Britain, more of the surviving heads are made of white Mediterranean marble than those in Germany. Some of this might well be due to the fashion for collecting antique statuary over the last few hundred years, even to the extent that some pastiche examples were created in the 17th or 18th centuries. These, of course, should be omitted from consideration and result in just 20 heads left for our analysis. The remaining quantity of marble amongst those heads on both sides of the channel would suggest that several might have been imported, perhaps ready carved. But the existence of this twice life-size head of Constantine from York is carved of British stone and shows that at least some were locally made. A number of heads of bronze, too, may have been cast close to where they were found or before set up, since the raw materials for copper alloys for statuary were readily found in the northwest. Here is the head of Nero from a river in Suffolk, and the head of what might be Trajan or could be a local official, found in the river near Castra Vetra II by Xanten in Germany. The heads in Britain seem more often to come from rural or villa sites as well as military or urban areas, while those in Germany tend to be only from civic centres or military structures, like the Principia of a fort. In both regions, they can be dated often within two clusters. One group from the mid to late 1st century, representing Julio-Claudians most often, and some Flavians, and then a group from the early to mid 2nd century into the early 3rd century, focusing on Trajan, Hadrian, generally skipping the Antonines and then depicting the Severans. A particular temporal and geographic cluster in Britain around the Chichester area is interesting and comprises a marble head of Germanicus or Caligula from Broadbridge, though it is more than likely that this is one of the 18th century copies. A marble head of Nero or an important local boy from Fishbourne, a Purbeck marble dedicatory inscription to Nero from within Chichester, a bronze arm from a life-size statue nearby, and a bronze finger or thumb, probably from a different statue. There is clearly considerable early Roman activity in the area, and ornamenting new parts of a conquered province with imperial statuary seems entirely appropriate. We can see a parallel here with the amazing recent discovery of the gilded bronze horse's head at Waldegurmes beyond the German limits, set up during a period of Augustan expansion in land which was then very swiftly lost. It would appear that this head comes from an equestrian statue, quite possibly of the emperor himself. There are some bronze sculptural fragments from very early contexts at Verulamium or St Albans too, and the head of Nero from the river that we've already seen may originally have been set up in Colchester, the first capital of the province of Britannia. Alternatively, to explain the Chichester examples, we might notice the close location of Fishbourne Palace and the territory of a tame client king in the pre-Roman and early Roman period in Toggy-Dubnus. It's possible that with elite connections to court, as is sometimes proposed for Toggy-Dubnus, came provision or interest in sculpture to ornament both the private villa and the local area. Of course, we should remember that marble sculpture as decoration in villas is virtually unknown in Britain, except for a few smaller pieces from Woodchester in Gloucestershire and some sites in the environs of London, even though these villas have amazing mosaics and wall paintings. Yet we do have the example of the bust of Pertinax, governor of Britain before he became emperor, found at Lullingstone, alongside a bust of his father, both perhaps installed privately in the villa if, as governor, Pertinax possibly lived there. Typically, however, the direct presence of an emperor himself within the province does not seem to have provided the occasion for putting up a statue in public, at least not in Britain. We do have the Hadrian head from London, perhaps associated with that emperor's visit in AD 122, and a bust of Geta, who came here with the rest of the Severian family at the end of the 2nd century. Also, this marble head of Septimius Severus from Bonn. The lack of images of Claudius, Vespasian, Titus, and Septimius Severus in Britain are remarkable, given the time those men spent in the province and their connection to it. By contrast, we might not expect images of Nero and Trajan, given their lack of a visit, and yet several possible portraits of each remain. It does not therefore seem possible to propose imperial visits as a general rule for the appearance of statuary. Of course, it's more than likely that a number of images that there once were no longer survive. Marble often fed the lime kilns, limestones or sandstones could be reused in later building projects, and bronze was readily melted down and recast. Indeed, though I have set out the paucity of portraits as a particular problem in understanding the imperial images of this area, I have not yet mentioned the considerable volume of bronze fragments that do survive. And here is a selection shown on the slide. It's possible to propose the existence of around 100 more statues based on the portions that survive, and these tend to be of life-size or slightly larger than life-size statues, sometimes gilded, and perhaps showing poses that would not be inconsistent with an imperial image. The fragments in Germany are much more numerous than in Britain, one cache from the legionary fortress at Bonn totaling over 1,000 pieces. The fragments are typically found at key military sites or main towns in Britain and Germany, and within those sites, they tend to be found in central public spaces, such as the forum areas at Gloucester and Wroxeter, and the centre of both auxiliary and legionary forts on the German limes. If these are correctly identified as statues of the emperor, it is likely they were common, part of the fabric of public space, particularly in military installations. The erection of statues in this way perhaps demonstrating loyalty of the troops or civilians. This link between emperor or central government and military site could have operated irrespective of geography, though the appearance of the sculptures in different locations might be adapted to local needs, abilities, and taste. So that wraps up my case studies, and I'd just like to finish by concluding that it's hard to generalise or provide one new model or theory that governs the appearance of Romano-British sculpture within the Northwest region. The case studies I've presented today overwhelmingly show how patchy and unpredictable the creation and use of sculpture was in this part of the empire. It's not possible to show that the private or personal interactions of villa owners, the contacts between certain army units at specific times, the existence of certain religious groups, or a general interest in dedicating to a goddess with power over movement to luck, are the overriding key factor in determining the appearance of sculpture more generally. Only the apparent need for proof of loyalty from distant subjects or army units serving on the frontiers serves as a more widespread factor in the creation and erection of statues, and even this observation is based on a vast quantity of what is in effect scrap metal. I suppose offering this collection of observations as a conclusion might seem rather unimpressive, and yes, my work continues. However, for now, I think this is my point, that by deconstructing the boundaries, especially the provincial boundaries, and accessing instead the interactions of the ancient world, we can seek to build a new geography of the art of the Northwest provinces, based on a more granular understanding of the contacts, interests, and identities of the people involved, and we can show why sculpture looked and operated as it did. Thank you very much for tuning in, and take care, everyone.